Hello everyone. Today we're going to be dissecting martial arts films as a genre. We're going to be talking about what they represent to their audiences, how they're formed, and how they portray struggles between groups. So my core thesis is that martial arts films serve largely as a working class male power fantasy. They're about asserting one's dignity against perceived bullies. These might be framed along class lines, along national lines, along racial lines, but there's almost always a sense of martial arts films represent the little guy standing up to the big guy. These are often, the martial arts hero is often portrayed as being the champion of a community. Someone who is reticent to violence themselves, but needs to take action in order to defend the honor, integrity, or safety of a subaltern group. So, when I talk about martial arts films, I am specifically talking about fist-fighting movies, rather than sword-fighting movies. So we are not going to be talking about Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. We're not going to be talking about Hero. God help us, we are not going to be talking about Mulan. These films fall into an older genre of storytelling of martial chivalry fiction, wuxia in Chinese. This goes way, way back to the 13th century in literary form and to the 1930s in filmic form. In sort of the things that differentiate these martial chivalry stories from what we're going to be talking about as martial arts films is they tend to focus on swordplay. That is the most visible aspect of it. They tend to have ancient or medieval settings rather than modern or recent historical settings. They're often highly fantastical in nature, or at least a little bit. Here we see Jet Li and I think that's Donnie Yen playing Long Sky in Hero, flying through the air. This whole concept of like martial arts skill sort of unbounds you from gravity, that you can make your body lighter through the practice of, what's called Qinggong in Chinese, is one of the main tropes of this genre. And it also has heroes who exist outside of the normal social order. They tend to be outlaws, mercenaries, bodyguards. They tend to be part of a sort of parallel world that does not conform to a traditional medieval Confucian hierarchical social structure. So, that's what we're not talking about. What we are talking about are martial arts films. We can call fist-fighting movies instead of sword-fighting movies. And fist-fighting movies come out of sword-fighting movies. The sword-fighting movies came first. Fist-fighting movies emerge in the 1970s, and it really does all kick off with Bruce Lee making the big boss in 1971. I believe 71. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. So they focus on fist fighting rather than sword fighting. They have a more realistic action style, right? No one's flying through the air, or if they are, they do it for very, very short periods of time. They tend to have modern or recent historical settings. So typically, if they are doing a historical setting, it's going to maybe go back to the turn of the century or so. There's a lot that are set during World War II or during the 1920s, some maybe in the end of the 19th century. And rather than being outside the social order, heroes, with a couple notable exceptions we'll talk about later, tend to come from the bottom of the social order. So the key trope that makes a martial arts movie truly is fist fights, right? Unarmed, hand-to-hand combat. Or there are armaments in play, they are secondary, right? It's become more and more common to kind of blend these genres. And you'll see things where, like, sometimes they're fist fighting, sometimes they're sword fighting, or occasionally, the hero is attacked by someone carrying a knife or a gun, and he has to defend himself unarmed. But the principal mode of conflict is unarmed combat. And why that's significant is that in a gunfight or a sword fight, the expectation is that someone's gonna die, right? Guns don't have a stun setting. Neither do swords. So the stakes of a fist fight are different. The hero's life might be threatened, particularly if it's one of those scenes where, you know, he has to fight an armed opponent unarmed. But very rarely is the hero trying to kill the villain. Whereas in a gunfighting movie, whether that's like a modern day John Wick style gunfight movie or an old timey Western, the hero usually is trying to kill the villain. So what's at stake is not life or death. What's at stake is dominance in a social order. You're not trying to kill the guy. You're not trying to take him out. You're trying to beat him up. You're trying to put him in his place. You're trying to put him down. So one of the other key tropes of this genre is this idea of training and mentorship. In contrast to my superheroes lecture, there's no radioactive spiders here, right? There's no getting hit by lightning like the Flash. There's no wizard who gives you a magic word that transforms you. To acquire power, you need hard, constant work, internal discipline, and often there's some kind of mentor figure that guides the hero through this process. And I already know people are talking about, but what about Batman? Batman did tons of training. But that all came later, right? After the 1970s, when martial arts films gained popularity in the US, comic books started bringing more of those ideas in, right? So all the Ra's al Ghul, League of Shadows, League of Assassins, Batman trained how to be a ninja in a ninja monastery in Tibet, bullshit that, you know, was the focus of Batman Begins. That all came in the 1970s. Likewise with characters like Iron Fist, Daredevil, right? So the idea of training as part of a superhero origin story is an adaptation of martial arts films. Old school, so 1960s and before, superhero origin stories really don't tend to have this element in them. I want to talk about physiques in martial arts films. So is part of this idea of the big guy can beat up the little guy, right? So let's compare and contrast the bodies of Bruce Lee and Arnold Schwarzenegger here. Two of our iconic martial arts hero versus our iconic kind of all-purpose action hero. Arnold was known as being just the biggest guy around, right? That's how he got so famous. Bruce Lee was kind of tiny. I think he weighed like 135 pounds. But he's also incredibly shredded, right? His abs, I should have gotten a shirtless picture of Arnold. Bruce Lee has much better abs than Arnold Schwarzenegger does. And so there still is this fetishization of the male physique, but it is a different fetishization of the male physique than the standard one. So there's this theme of David versus Goliath, right? That it is not exciting to watch the big guy beat up the little guy. It is really exciting to watch the little guy beat up the big guy. And that goes to one of the core concepts of martial arts cinema in the way that it frames physical power. Physical power is not the same thing as physical size. That being strong, being powerful, is the byproduct of training and discipline rather than the genetic lottery of height and weight. And therefore, it goes back to these kind of working class values of the training montage. You don't get strong by being born with it, right? You get strong by earning it, by working hard at it. So now we can start talking about this idea of the martial arts hero as a working class hero. And first of all, I want to talk about there's two giant exceptions to this rule, and that is spies and cops, who are frequent heroes of martial arts films, but that is because spy movies and police movies were already a thing before martial arts films came on the scene, and they rapidly hybridized with martial arts films. So let's exclude all the movies where Jackie Chan is a cop from Hong Kong and all the movies where Jet Li is a spy from Taiwan. And what we're left with when we look at the occupations of those heroes is that they're overwhelmingly some kind of working class, right? That they're farmers, they're laborers, they are small business owners, and this brings them into conflict, typically with some sort of corrupt bourgeoisie enemy, usually in the form of a wealthy gangster who seeks to exploit the working class or who looks down upon the working class. The very first of these fist-fighting movies, The Big Boss, was deeply entrenched in this idea. The hero is a factory worker at an ice factory in Thailand, I believe, who discovers that his boss is running a criminal enterprise and has killed workers who uncovered that criminal enterprise. And then through the use of physical violence, he sort of brings justice to this situation and avenges the wronged workers. And this focus on, so this mixture of working class identity and this focus on the body as weapon really blend together. And that's why these movies have traditionally been so popular with working class audiences. Unlike the cowboy hero, right, with his gun and his horse, you don't need anything material to be a martial arts hero. You don't need a gun, you don't need a car, you don't even need a shirt, right? You just need your body and your mind. You just need that honed, trained body that you acquired through hard work and that disciplined mindset which reflects work ethic. There is nothing that anyone can take away from you in this. It's a common trope in the Western of like being disarmed, and being disarmed means that you're emasculated. You don't have your gun, you can't fight back. The martial arts hero, because he has no weapon, cannot be disarmed and thus cannot be emasculated through disarmament. So let's talk about now how this plays out in terms of nationalism, which is another super common theme in martial arts films. One of the sort of trope fights in a martial arts film, in addition to that sort of David versus Goliath fight, is the style versus style match, right? Where you have a Kung Fu expert fighting a karate expert, or you have a Muay Thai expert fighting an American kickboxer. And what these martial arts style rivalries really are very thinly coated national rivalries. So here we have a scene from the movie Fearless, starring Jet Li, where we have a Kung Fu expert fighting a Japanese martial arts expert. And what this really is about asserting the dignity of China on a global stage. Particularly if you watch any Hong Kong or Chinese martial arts film that takes place during the 1930s or 1940s, which is a very common time frame for martial arts films, it is going to be about this. It is going to tell you the story of some plucky Chinese Kung Fu expert who fights a series of hand-to-hand combats with Japanese and Western fighters, and by doing so asserts the strength and dignity of China as a nation. Fists of Fury, Bruce Lee's second movie, was all about this, right? It was about a Kung Fu expert who beats up a bunch of karate experts during World War II when Japan is occupying China. And there was this notion that had been thrown around in the 20th century of China being the sick man of Asia. That China was a former power that was now weak and sort of toothless, and that Japan had sort of replaced it as the center of political and military power in East Asia. So movies like Fist of Fury and like Fearless are really pushing back against this historical narrative. And they're trying to say, no, China was never weak. See, we'll beat you up. If we were weak, then we wouldn't be able to beat you up in these hand-to-hand fights. The Ip Man movies, if you watch any of those are more recent, rife with this. There's a scene where he beats up, 10 or 20 karate experts at the same time because his kung fu is so much more powerful than their karate. And thus, because China is so much more powerful than Japan. This is great. This is a scene from Legend of Drunken Master, which really hones in on a lot of these themes. It's set during Imperial occupied British occupied Hong Kong, and was also made during British occupied Hong Kong. As you may recall, Hong Kong was still a British colony until 1997. And Hong Kong was the basis of this genre for a long time. Now it's much more international. But this is a genre that has its roots in an occupied country. And so this tendency to have these fight scenes where a Chinese hero sort of takes on a foreign aggressor really sort of represents this anxiety or this sort of tension of Hong Kong being a colony in the modern age, right? And its sort of desire for independence. And the plot of Legend of Drunken Master deals with sort of corrupt British officials who are smuggling Chinese artifacts outside of China to put them in British museums. And this is all happening through like a British-owned steel mill where the workers are on strike. So we also have this that class warfare angle going on. So they're oppressing your country, they're oppressing your workers, and Jackie Chan will stand up for, the Chinese working class against the British imperial overlords with the strength of his kung fu, with the strength of his body. There's a similar theme with movies that take place in expat communities. Rumble in the Bronx here is one of the best examples, wherein a sort of person from China or Hong Kong or otherwise East Asia will go and visit their family in the West, and they will then have to protect their family from sort of the corruption of the Western world. That, I believe in Rumble in the Bronx, Jackie Chan's family have like a small shop in New York, which is being terrorized by local gangs, who are almost all white in this movie, and he has to go beat up those gangs so they will stop terrorizing and oppressing his family members and allow his, kin to thrive, to sort of free them from the persecution of being a minority in the United States. So, some recommended reading. The Big Boss, I mentioned a couple times. It's the first of these fist fighting movies. It's Bruce Lee's first action movie. Deals heavily with these themes of class. Fist of Fury, his second movie, deals heavily with these themes of race and national identity. Snake and Eagle's Shadow, one of Jackie Chan's first movies, deals heavily with these themes of mentorship and also a little bit the class angle. I believe he plays a janitor who's sort of picked on, and then he's taught kung fu by this old man, and that strengthens him. Legend of Drunken Master, I talked about, deals heavily with imperialism and class warfare and all this stuff. Rumble in the Bronx, likewise. Fearless, I also mentioned a couple times, very similar to Fist of Fury, deals with this idea of asserting Chinese national identity through hand-to-hand combat. And then Ong Bak and The Protector are two Thai films that deal very, very heavily with class identity. Both of them, the protagonist, played by Tony Jaa in both movies, is a peasant from the countryside who has something stolen from him, and so he goes to the big city in order to beat the living bejesus out of everyone until he gets it back. And it's very much asserting kind of the dignity of the rural working class as opposed to this against the condescension of a cosmopolitan sort of urban bourgeoisie. And both times he's going to reclaim traditional symbols of Thai identity as well. In Ong Bak, it's part of a statue of the Buddha from his village shrine. In The Protector, it's an elephant. He plays an elephant farmer whose elephant is stolen, and he has to go beat up everyone in Australia until he gets it back. Kind of a goofy premise, but also elephants are kind of a symbol of Thai identity. So those are my recommended readings. I'm going to post some recommended watchings for you guys. And thank you so much for sitting in on my little lecture here.